Hi there. In this lecture we see Mikhail Tal against Bobby Fischer in 1959. The Bled Belgrade candidates. This is round 20. d4 from Tal. We see Fischer playing the King's Indian defense. And we see Bishop e2 here, black castles, knight f3, e5, and the Petrosian system, this early d5. Fischer plays knight bd7, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, a6, Tal castles, queen e8, so unpinning the knight, knight d2, knight h7, and now b4. So white's strategic break in general will be c5, sometimes f3 and bishop f2 to support c5. Now Fischer plays a really interesting move here, bishop f6. It really forces, in a way, white to change from the thematic play to kind of improvise here. It's a very unusual looking move. In one respect, sure, getting rid of that bishop and then later coming down with pawns like on f4 and g5 without the bad bishop can sometimes be an advantage. However, this bishop also, you could say, adds solidity to the dark squares around black's camp. So perhaps Tal is already having the intuition of changing plan a little bit, not so much the c5 break as kind of putting pressure on the dark square points of black's position. If instead a move like h5, for example f3, bishop h6, king h1, let's imagine bishop e3. This is a kind of thematic thing a King's Indian player likes to do to get the bishop out of the pawn chain. But it seems here that overall this should be quite pleasant for white. It is an interesting battle, and black, as mentioned, sometimes does well to get rid of that bishop before pushing with pawns on the king side. White should have an advantage. There's moves like g4. White generally has a space advantage here, of course, and the king is fairly safe. White can kind of reinforce the f5 square, which has been weakened as well. And that's kind of one of the default plans of the Petrosian system, to try and provoke black into committal pawn moves and adjacent weaknesses, like light square weaknesses potentially. So this is kind of a typical fictional scenario, but it's kind of typical of what might happen, perhaps. So this is a kind of a radical move, bishop f6. Tal actually obliges and takes off that bishop. Knight h takes f6, so keeping the brakes on c5 there, not with the other knight. Knight b3, as though c5 is going to happen now. Queen e7, putting the brakes again on white playing c5. We see queen d2. If black had permitted c5, by the way, then c takes, that pawn gets to be weak. There's infiltration points. There's like c7, potentially b6 later. So generally, dissuading c5 is usually a good idea. Queen d2 now, you can see, is with tempo. So this is quite kind of alarming, because this tempo gain also means now black having to waste the move. The queen e3 does support c5 again. So the queen is taking the role of the bishop here to support that break. We see knight g8. And now c5 is played. f5. Now here is a really, really interesting specific plan to the position. Black has got rid of potentially a kind of bad bishop if these pawns all end up on dark squares. Guess what Tal plays here for 100 points? Okay. E takes f5. Yeah, this is a really interesting point in the game. After g takes f4. If black is left, to their devices, then things like f4 and a pawn storm could be dangerous later. Fischer really had a point getting rid of the bishop in this situation, because black could play for the g4 pawn break, which is black's thematic pawn break, and get a fairly decent position. For example, here white is only getting a small edge. Maybe black can avoid having a weak pawn on d6 and get some dynamic play perhaps on the g file. So white's edge would only be, it seems, small there. So this is a really interesting point in the game where after e takes, to just lock down against f4 and start to put pressure on black's dark square points generally to try and make the absence of the bishop be more felt. It was adding a kind of solidity to black's position. We have now Fischer playing e takes f4. A move like e4 does give up the d4 square. It seems also a move like e4 would mean maybe later king h1 and g4, try and use the g file, undermine black's structure there. So e takes f4. It does isolate this pawn though. There's two pawn islands here all of a sudden. Queen takes f4, d takes, and with that isolated pawn, so not minding losing a pawn here because of bishop d3, putting a lot of pressure on f5. Fischer snaps off another pawn, rook a e1, queen f6, and here this is a very interesting position after queen f6. We see an invasive rook e6 giving up c3. This is a really, really interesting sacrifice. It's not needed to even do this sacrifice. The position is strong in its own right. Bishop takes f5 check, for example here. There's queen takes c7. And all of a sudden, look at this. Because of these disconnection issues and the knight being pinned, there's actually rook takes f8 there. If queen g6, rook takes f8, there's nothing to recapture on f8. You know, check here, fine. White's material up here. It's quite a crushing position. So that was an interesting shot, just to play bishop takes f5 with this idea of queen takes c7. And if king g7, then actually rook e6 here is really strong, with access to the g6 square potentially now. And if queen takes, queen d4 check, and rook takes f5, it looks, you know, pretty devastating in these circumstances, that g6 square access. If the queen, you know, allowed rook g6 check, or queen g3 check first, perhaps, it looks pretty crushing anyway. So we have rook e6 though immediately. So a very, very interesting piece sacrifice by Tal. But should Fischer actually take it? Fischer did actually take it. If queen g7, this might actually be the best move. Queen takes b4 does protect the knight though now and take a pawn out. And here, for example, bishop takes f5 check is probably the biggest critical test of black's position. So rook takes would be a mistake of queen e4, but on king h8, queen d4, white's edge might not be so pronounced. It's only a relatively small advantage. But anyway, queen takes c3 was played, and this is where, you know, this is one Fischer game where he looks like one of Paul Morphy's opponents in a way. All his pieces are kind of in bed, lying around, mostly on the first rank here. This is a very, very rare occasion indeed to have this kind of setup, being a bit greedy here, owning the knight on the second rank and the queen out. And Tal maybe, you know, suspected something's up here, well, and supported that with calculation to a large extent. Because after bishop takes f5 check, there are huge problems that black is kind of facing here. If king g7, this wasn't played, then rook g6 check here, bishop b1 check is dragging the king back to the center as though Fischer is a Paul Morphy opponent. If queen e5, rook e6 check looks strong, and if king d8, you know, this looks to be crumbling. Black is crumbling. The knight is holding the c1 square as well, by the way. There's no check even. So we see Fischer playing rook takes f5, queen takes f5, check king h8. And here, a tempo gainer, rook f3, which means actually rook g3 is potentially really dangerous later. Queen b2. We see rook e8. And maybe, you know, Tal had just calculated up to this point. It's very, very difficult for black, being so pinned down, and many of his pieces on that first rank. It's a very precarious position indeed. There's hardly any counterplay, with white having a clear threat of rook g3 potentially, as one example. You know, So this is very dangerous. Fischer tries to give back material with knight df6. It's a bit desperate. If queen g7, then rook g3, and this situation, rook takes g7 is just crushing because of rook g takes g8. So that rook shielding the g8 square and then taking out a8, white's actually winning there. If b6, then in fact there's a forced mate in 14 with rook takes g8 technically. There's a forced mate in 14. I'll just quickly show you. Yeah, the rook comes down with the queen. And of course this is winning, but I'm just going to show you this forced checkmate. Yeah, actually, you know, it's not worth showing it. It's completely winning there. And I will show you because I mentioned it. So it's essentially, yeah, it's calculated as a forced mate in 14, basically on rook takes g8. But if you don't want to calculate that, there's also just rook g3. This is black's just pinned down. There's no major checks. You know, the knight controls a1, c1. The queen controls b1. The knight is also controlling d4. There's no major checks here. If we look at this position, maybe this is building up our evaluation capabilities, because I think one should suspect intuitively that there are severe problems as well. It looks visually crushing, but we do like to have concrete proof, and it's good to sometimes need concrete proof. But yes, how to defend g8? So, you know, this is a problematic position. So anyway, basically, this is a big threat, rook g3. So we have this giving back material. So queen takes f6 check though. Queen takes, rook takes, and black is still really pinned down. And there's about to be a move like this, rook f8. So king g7, what else anyway, rook ff8, knight e7 trying to cling on and tactically being, you know, resourceful to the end. You know, if rook takes, then king takes. But white now plays kind of Tal plays a kind of sadistic knight route here, knight a5, and it's a glorious route here planned, knight c4 to e5 to support rook f7, essentially, which will be kind of winning. And it's difficult to kind of stop this from occurring. Basically, h5, h4, we have rook b8, knight c4, and now b5 is played. If a5, it doesn't matter, knight e5, and then rook f7 check, and rook h8 would be mating. So b5 was played, but now knight e5, and actually Fischer resigned here. Yeah, this is quite an embarrassing final position for the pieces. If he played on, say, with a5, then again, you know, rook f7 check and rook h8 is checkmate. If bishop e6, this is rather desperate. Rook takes e7 is really quite accurate here. Check. If king takes, the point is knight g6 check. Taking here, and it's kind of all over. The pawns are just too slow. For example, knight takes h5, then knight f6 is mating. The pawns are far too slow over here to cause any trouble. So king f8, rook f7 is checkmate. Or king h8, rook h7 is checkmate. So yes, we have a very, very interesting game here, I would say. A very unique game, starting with that bishop f6. Perhaps against lesser opponents, opponents wouldn't have shifted the gravity of their plans to be on dark square pressure points like Tal. He locked down black's potential kingside attacking opportunities later. So I think that's one takeaway point. When a certain, you know, against the kings in your similar structures, when the bishops come off, you should maybe perhaps feel that there's a certain lack of solidity on that bishop. It was adding solidity, and we see that kind of represented here with white trying to put pressure points on dark squares to exploit that lesser solidity of the position after the dark square bishops had been exchanged off. This is very interesting, you know, starting to be really dynamic here with the two pawns dropping off, but with f5 in sight, f5 could have been taken here it seems, with that, remarkable, tactical ideas here. But yeah, rook e6. It was very tempting just to take the knight, but this is a big mistake. So queen g7 was the best. So yeah, takeaway points here. And we reached this position where black's really hardly got any counterplay, and it's kind of frozen in a way, pinned down and kind of frozen. Can't really do anything here, even though, yeah, it looks as though black's got a bit of material, but the pieces are kind of immobilized, frozen. And yeah, it's kind of helpless. So very, very interesting game, what it represents. Very great flexibility, changing one's plan according to a certain key bishop exchange that black had invited, rather unusually, I would say. So yeah, some interesting takeaway points there, I think. And I hope you enjoyed that one. So this is really fascinating, these clashes. In this tournament, yeah, this was Tal's tournament, of course, to win this, and then later in the next year challenge Mikhail Botvinnik for the World Championship match. So yeah, it's a grueling tournament, so each player played each other 4 times in this grueling all tournament. So this is one of the 4 games. Very, very interesting game. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much. Hi there. Thanks for getting to the end of the YouTube video. If you would like to see other Mikhail Tal games, I actually have an amazing course for Mikhail Tal, which is currently at 4.9 with over 400 students. You can check this out from the Kingscrusher TV page. So Chess Strategy and Tactics, Mikhail Tal's amazing games. You can check out some free preview videos as well here. If you do expand all sections, you can see the preview links to get some free previews. So I hope you do check out this course index and the free previews. So I really had a thrilling time actually checking out Mikhail Tal's games. So yeah, the YouTube video here you saw was just a sample from this course. I hope you check it out. Okay, thanks so much. Oh, by the way, comments, questions, likes, shares, all appreciated. And if you did get to this part of the video, please do leave some sort of comment like Tal fan. Okay, thanks again.